Here's how you establish a storyline that properly makes all of its suspensions of disbelief up front, so that the audience knows exactly what makes the story fictional and the foundation for immersion is instantiated. Firstly, you decide what setting you're in. This will directly correlate with which precedents you will need to follow and satisfy to maintain immersion. Precedents are the recurring tropes, themes, and traits that the venue finds popular and can be seen as an established rhetoric for the negotiation of which suspensions of disbelief are accounted for by default in a given setting. Suspension of disbelief, then, is decided based on the natural law of whatever setting is imposed. This is specifically, but certainly not exclusively, the time period. That is the fourth principle of design. Setting is everything when addressing immersion. This is because everything you hear or read in a story with the setting you are familiar with leads you to subconsciously look for precedents set in that setting, like deserts being hot and oceans being wet. This includes suspending your disbelief by default, like assuming faster than light travel is possible in an interstellar setting far in the future, even though it isn't, which anybody familiar with the physics has known for years, in which case you decide to explain why it is possible in your universe and set new precedents. Or you can move on and decide not to have that battle and exclude that as a possible part of your own originality. You continue to do this with all the precedents for your setting. Now you decide what kind of story you are telling, what kind of conflict. In games, particularly a simulation, these are the same and only steps. The only thing you need to do from here is flesh out your setting, and the story will tell itself. Characters will naturally formulate around their setting and how they interact with it. Now, how to tell if you're doing a good job building your immersion and involving the player/audience with it. This can be done by examining what kind of plot, independent of conflict, does your story equate to. A character-driven plot, or a setting-driven plot? What is the difference, you would surely ask in kind? Well, it's really quite simple. In the latter, the conflict emerges from the setting primarily, and in the former it does not. But what is the significance of these classifications? Well, there are several. Setting-driven plots are more immersed. Their conflicts are unique to that setting. Character-driven plots are more relatable because they are about people and their problems. Everybody's a person. In game design, these two properties are very much at odds with each other. Even though the most talented designers will find it difficult to make a conflict both relatable and unique. Just try, for instance, to imagine articulating the emotion of a person who is over 10,000 years old in a setting where that is normal, of which you are not familiar with, and making them relevant to the audience when no person who has ever lived can really say what that person would be feeling. Now, which of these competing properties is more important is up to the writer for the most part, except when it comes to gaming. In gaming, immersion is key to simulatory games. For other games, it's not, which means the fourth principle of design doesn't matter as much. Now, I will admit this is one of the biggest controversies I deal with personally. That is the difference between the schools of thought in game design, namely simple versus complex. I am a self-acclaimed student of complex because I want to take gaming as a medium to the level of culture, and I believe it is the best avenue to do so, and the culture of gaming as it exists now is undermining, to say the least. Of course, I will go into greater detail, but that'll have to wait until my fourth video. To summarize, though, the School of Simplicity has only one real priority. Is the game fun? Virtually every other thing can be sacrificed to make way for this, in simplicity. Now back to the video again. In setting-driven plots, in this case simulatory games, the conflict is dynamic. How will I survive today? Where do I hide? How will I find food? Etc. In character-driven plots, they are much more static. I can't forget my past. Do they respect me? Is my 7-inch dick really above average? Etc. This is also reflected in games. In simulatory, the environment is a collection of different problems at different times that will usually correlate with each other. In cooperation, the conflict is always the other person or opponents. And in objective, it is a set, single arbitrary goal. The proof of this comes from the fact that once you have enough connected arbitrary goals that are hopefully substantiated by writing, then you will effectively have a simulation, as explained before, in reverse. Finally, and most importantly, a character-driven plot can be told almost exactly the same way when you change the setting. This is incredibly important. This is how you tell if you have done a good job with developing your setting. If your story has primary problems unique to that setting, that cannot be replicated in any other setting, you have a well-written setting. You have creative setting. Your setting is what drives the story because that story cannot be told in any other way. I'll give you some examples. Hamlet and the Lion King, character-driven plots. These stories could be told almost word per word until before around the ending after you translate Shakespeare. Another semi-good indicator is if you remember the names of the characters in the story when the story itself isn't something that stands out to you as a favorite for any reasons like nostalgia. If you can, odds are the story was character-driven because the character development was likely more important than the setting. A quick example before I go into depth about setting-driven plot. The movie Jaws, for instance, is setting-driven. It's about a place where a monster can kill people that go into the ocean and can also destroy sea vessels to get at the people on board. You can't tell that story in space, or on tundra, or in a metropolis without seriously delving into fiction when Jaws is set in realistic fiction. In this story, the characters are insignificant enough such that they can literally be fed to the plot. And for good measure, if I asked you to tell me what the names of all the main characters in Jaws are, most of you couldn't, whereas practically everyone can tell me the names of every major character of Lion King. Of course, this isn't a unique property of setting-based plot, just a good indicator of it. Now, I know I'm coming across as way past strident at this point, but as I stated before, I'm taking myself and game design very seriously so that you don't have to, and because I really don't give a shit. But seriously, the whole purpose of these videos, after all, is to illustrate that templates that follow cookie-cutter designs are a bane to the genre, and I expect to find those who will oppose my design with their own. I look forward to the challenge of seeing whose is better. That said, it's also a good time for me to be even more controversial. Since we are on the topic of setting-driven plot, I feel like I need to take this opportunity to dispel a certain myth that has been propagated by games like Dark Souls. That is the significance of the unreliable narrator, and the idea that it is somehow innately superior for storytelling than the reliable narrator. I'm speaking, of course, about how plot can be implied rather than told, and can thus be treated like a puzzle, where part of the game is to figure out and enjoy the satisfaction of coming to a sound conclusion. Well, unfortunately, this doesn't really make a lot of sense, because a plot that has a definitive conclusion is not a plot that is unreliable. A series like Dark Souls doesn't give concrete answers for most of its lore, and therefore remains inconclusive. And yet people often cite this as a strength, when it's really just poorly told story, and says nothing to the quality of that story. If I were to tell you about my trip to the groceries and make it sound as ambiguous as possible as to who I met, how and where I found my groceries, and in what condition they were in, and whether or not I stole them or ended up paying for them, and if I did, how much I paid for them, and then told you the answer to none of these things, I can make it sound as interesting as possible and add as much undertone as necessary to keep you interested. And yet at the end of the day, it's just a trip to the grocery store. But you will be forced to make up whatever conclusion you wanted about where I was, who I met, what I was really doing, and how I really got my things. This is like giving an alibi to the police and citing no specific information. The story is meaningless. Bottom line, if a story is worth telling, you tell it. You tell it like it is. When a story isn't really that interesting, you embellish it with suspense and twists. This is a fundamental fact about writing that is parodied all the time, when dull aspects of a story are intentionally not gilded with superficial value, like cryptic dialogue, and are said plainly, or plot twists that are deliberately made obvious. The problem that everyone seems to misunderstand or ignore is that unreliable narration comes at a price. It's not just a clever way to tell an otherwise boring story. It comes at the price of conclusiveness, of meaning, of consistency. This is because when you have to make an assumption about a piece of a storyline's cause and effect tree, the storyline's progression comes to a halt, because every cause and effect that precedes it now is also therefore an assumption, and hence has non-concrete conclusions unless the preceding piece of the story is later confirmed, in which case it is no longer unreliable and was only told as such for embellishment. The relevance of a story and its details emerge due to the fact that it conforms to a hierarchy of writing in which a story's properties have different amounts of significance to their logical progression of the story. The hierarchy is as follows. Setting. Setting dictates everything in the story, from the way the plot unfolds to how the characters interact. Second, characters. Characters are the active variables shaped by the way they interact with their setting and each other. The result of this interaction is the third layer, which is plot. Plot is the events that arise from those interactions between characters and their environment. Lastly, we have conflict, which is the problems and resolutions that arise from the plot. This illustrates perfectly why climax is tantamount to peak of the story's conflict, because the reasons that logically preceded it. In other words, the only reason why climax has any weight is because we know why it is significant to that story, because our understanding of its other components have properly established it. Imagine, for instance, watching two people fight and having no backstory on either of them. It would be inconsequential as to who wins or loses. When you use unreliable narrator, you are cutting out some of a story's components by making them assumptions. The details of story should never be left out unless they are trivialized by the setting. This is the fifth principle of design. The only details that can be excluded without warranting further suspension of disbelief are the ones trivialized by setting, which Dark Souls, to its credit, does correctly for the most part, I suppose. But to give an example, if I find a sword or a key in the middle of nowhere with no one else around, and that sword or key ends up helping the plot progress, the story is guilty of Deus Ex Machina. The only reason the protagonist succeeds in any adversity down the road, no matter how great, is now due entirely to luck, because if I hadn't found that random sword or key, I would have never succeeded in even reaching that adversity. Remember, a plot's believability is only as strong as its weakest part. Whereas if I find that sword or key not far from where it came from or was last used, the setting has trivialized how it ended up there and why I found it. But even still, this is a rather short leash because more often than not, these things are consumable in some way, whether because they can break, fall down a cliff and get lost, or get taken by someone else, who would then have to conveniently decide not to lock a door and then leave it open or throw away the item after using it where I can still retrieve it. The point being that in 100% of cases, conclusive, reliable narration trumps unreliable narration unless discovering the plot is the conflict itself, like a mystery or a puzzle. Even if the opposite is true about reliable narration, in which you run the risk of being boring or too straightforward, to which I say, make your story more interesting. If you as the audience are not interested in hearing the story, then you're not interested in hearing the story. It's your fault. Writers should never have to conform to luring its readers in with piecemeal storytelling because the readers don't like it when content is exposed up front instead of laid out suspensively for effect. That's like picking up a book and skipping the first chapters because it was filled with too much story for you, and I just wanted to get to the parts with action and sex. It's simply not how you write long storylines. Suspense and mystery should be genuine. It should come from the story itself being uncertain how it will end due to the lack of ability of characters to control the setting and each other, not from simply missing out what's going on in the first place. This is the sixth principle of design. Suspense must be genuine. Otherwise, you are guilty of milking the situation for purely sensationalist purposes, so you can get more views, or money, or readers, etc., etc. This kind of thing is reprehensible, and it is all too common to see suspense that is essentially faked by characters, who in their position should have a completely different demeanor that is consistent to what is eventually revealed later in the plot as to what they knew or had at the time. Now for a more complex example of setting-driven plot. Ghost in the Shell is a very well-written, fleshed-out scientific fiction. In nearly every episode, the author, Kenji Kamiyama, presents conflict that is unique to that setting. Sticking to the first two episodes, the transference of a personality from a cyberbrain to another in the first episode is a trait to that series that cannot be replicated with any other setting with any ease. Even though the fact is not revealed until towards the end, it is still the culprit of the conflict. In the very next episode, a personality has been planted into an inhumanoid machine that goes out of control until it is later revealed that it acted on its own accord. Again, something that cannot be replicated without mimicking the setting that allowed for that unique conflict. These are story-specific conflicts, and even though the series revolves around a group of characters and even dedicates an entire episode to one, this is how a writer flexes his or her muscle in terms of strength of his or her setting and writing ability. They are saying that my story is objectively unique because of these ideas. Keep in mind that he could have written any kind of fiction in that setting, but chose to write setting-specific conflict to make use of his setting. This is why it is immersive, and why you don't ask yourself every episode to forgive certain details, or at least certainly not as many as you would in less original stories, because the suspension of disbelief is the conflict, and not a bridge to it, and why the explanation for it is the plot, and not details intentionally left out of it. The setting is what allows for the plot. It is not just a prop to it. This is also why other types of stories, romance, mystery, horror, and so forth, can be told in the greater context of a scientific, historical, or realistic fiction, except when they fail to utilize their setting. in which case it wouldn't matter what setting they are told in because they would be character-driven plots. And before I continue, I would also like to expand on what constitutes a setting and a character. Starting with the latter, a character is essentially anything the author decides to give attention to and reacts to the setting and or other characters and is distinguished from the setting itself. They can be dependent on them like other characters, or they can react as unique independent third-party characters. This can be anything from objects to people, but can also include abstract things like weather or culture. And I say this because from what I can tell from my own experience, things like objects and even locations can be written like characters, leaving basically no absolute distinguishing features one can use to definitively classify something as a character and not a part of the setting, with one exception. In literature, a setting is something that works as a whole and is never absent from the audience except with intentional changes to the setting. Characters at least have to be specific enough so that they stand out. A pristine house, for instance, can stand out against the entirety of the setting if a setting is post-apocalyptic, or 200 years in the future, or on an alien planet, or any combination of these things that would make it stand out from the whole. Setting is all-encompassing. It is in every page of a book. It is in every scene in a movie. It is in every stage of a play. It is literally omnipresent. Things like time period, the level of fiction versus non-fiction, a universe with magic, or a universe with more than 3 dimensions. These are inescapable aspects of a story, and as such, would reasonably have the most weight in the plot. In fact, the severity itself of any given event that transpires must be measured against the setting to determine how dire it is. Example, getting stabbed in the stomach has much more implication in an Iron Age setting than in a setting with magic that can heal wounds easily, even though it is the exact same action. This is another proof of the 5th principle. Now to address how this pertains to games, which I only talked around earlier. Setting-based plot and character-based plot are not equivalent to the types of narrative conflict as outlined earlier. The reason these types of conflict need to be classified into just 2 is because of how well the plot translates into gameplay. In short, character-driven plots have very limited application in terms of interactive gameplay. Games that focus greatly on characterization are seldom simulatory games, and are more often appropriately labeled as glorified text games. By me. Needless to say, though, a setting-driven plot is much easier to translate into gameplay because the environment is already capable of fleshing out problems for the players to solve. This is especially true when a given source material is made into a game and it originally was not fleshed out enough to be interactive. Everyone listening can probably recall a game in which the actual gameplay had little or nothing to do with the source material. The biggest culprit of these tendencies are usually movies, specifically movies with character-driven plot. This, however, is really only evidence of a bigger problem, which is the fact that writing and game design are not inherently compatible. This, thankfully at least, seems to be a well-known fact among the industry, and it actually pursues addressing this problem consistently, unlike its other issues. I'm speaking, of course, about the fact that a scene or a chapter that is written in a book may not have interactable properties, normally dialogue, and so the source material forces the gameplay to come to a halt. In game design, this translates to what is commonly known as a cutscene, in which the plot or side plot is moved forward in some manner. The reason for games doing this is mostly due, I would guess, because of convention, but I would suspect it is primarily because cutscene offers a raw instance for more cinematic strength to be displayed, which is another way of saying, look how big my budget is. Look how amazing this game looks in a trailer with pre-rendered graphics and engaging camera effects. This is of course another ploy, and a successful one from the look of it, to sell games by making people focus on how flashy a trailer is instead of showing you its gameplay. Here's the obvious problem for anyone watching who is easily impressed by trailers without actual gameplay. When you play a game, you can assume that about 95% of your time will be spent using the engine that propagates the game itself. Only around 5% of your time will be spent playing the game watching these cinematics. And for anyone who plays a game for around 20 hours will eventually get into the habit of simply skipping the cutscenes entirely, lowering the actual time spent watching cinematics to less than 5%, and will continue to shrink as you reach 100 hours played or 1,000 hours played and so forth until you literally skip every cutscene. And yet despite this fact, cutscenes make up nearly 100% of trailers. Trailers have actually come to show content that you will only experience a small fraction of your time playing the game, and show you gameplay only during a small fraction of the trailer itself. These facts should obviously be reversed. A trailer should show you what you are going to be doing when you play this game. It is the most obvious thing in the world, and yet they do not. They will never do this. Even so-called gameplay trailers will make it as much effort as possible to show you things like QuickTime events or the like, which will display the most intricate of animations and most flashy in-game generated effects and so forth. It is the clearest of signs that the industry is marketed toward casuals for whom the first and only criteria a game needs to be good is how new it is, and the flashier this point is made, the better. Imagine if this were ever reversed, though, and the publishers actually had to match the amount of cutscene in their trailers with how much the game actually has. My guess is that we would have some really, really short games before we ever really got good games. Another point worth making is how easy it is to actually cover up a game that is in poor development with a trailer in order to get as many pre-orders as possible, which, by the way, are equally poisonous to the industry for the following reason. They can simply abandon vested interest in the project. The number of games that get this funding and then don't deliver continues to grow, and everyone who continues to pre-order games or season passes so they can get DLC a week earlier or some such nonsense is ruining it for everyone else. Finally, the last point I'll make on this tangent is the effect of AAA games and their massive post-production budgets have on the industry. Specifically, how they can easily eclipse the market by flooding it with games that are all essentially a copy of the previous one and or each other, when companies have to compete with each other for advertising time during all the important sales period. The companies with the most money to burn on advertisement will win. In the worst case scenario, legitimate content will be overshadowed by crap only because the smell of crap is saturated in the air. This means that game designers that actually did a good job by spending their money in pre-production because they actually care about the quality and originality lose out due to the fact that the industry doesn't value pre-production at all. And the companies that do can easily go bankrupt as a result, all because they didn't spend enough money in otherwise pointless and deceptive trailers, or even because their content isn't as easy to advertise in the same way because of their originality. But back to writing once more. The final point I wish to make in closing is what a story with all the aforementioned rules and facts held into account is capable of. What kind of power would that entail? What happens when a setting has been fully fleshed out such that the transition into gameplay becomes as natural as a game set in a modern setting, where we all have the available knowledge and atmosphere to draw on, and all you have to do to become an expert in that setting is be alive? Well, truth be told, you already know of a few instances when this has happened. Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, and such others were stories that went years into production, long before they were ever considered for application as gaming source material. They are the phenomenal stories that are worthy of the term epics. However, the one thing I'll point out to you beyond their age for which you can accredit the following point is none of these were written with the goal of becoming an interactive storyline. None of them were written to become games. They are the ones that set the precedence of the genre, but because of this, they can never surpass them. To do that, another series of epics with the same level of dedication that cannot be replicated is necessary, the possibility of which, when concerning implementation into game design, as I mentioned in my first video, is only a very recent development. The technology to do these epics justice and representative quality is a new opportunity, but even then we will have only still served to display the current precedents and will not have moved beyond them. To do this, epics that are inspired by them must exceed their precedents and set new ones. When this happens, it is immediately evident to the audience if they are versed in the genre. This is because this is what originality feels like, in case some of you don't remember. It is very distinct, and even unmistakably so. You know instantly when you have seen something that falls outside your experience and expectation, especially if you're a veteran of the genre. Let me share with you what I mean. Let's take a very popular story that has set many precedents of its own and is much younger than the classic epics. Younger than the old references, if you will. Dragon Ball Z, a series which was built off of its own precedents set forth in 1984, nearly 10 years after Star Wars, one of the classic epics of the genre, was released to film, but was clearly developed long before and continued development after. DBZ set many of its own precedents and inspired many adaptations of its concepts for years to come. However, upon critical examination of the story of DBZ, you will find it to have many glaring holes and vacancies to its story, let alone its setting. Its setting could not be further from fleshed out in any self-respecting author's eyes. Furthermore, while all of these concepts are somewhat daring and highly thrilling, all of them fall short of what could be considered literature. Nothing is really explained, and characters, both antagonists and protagonists included, make illogical decisions and hardly ever show growth. How is this explained? Well, simply put, it's a kid's show. It's not meant to be judged or interpreted by anyone outside of adolescence, and yet it is lovable all the same. Hence it is referenced all the time, down to the types of visual effects. So if it can be referenced and transitioned, you have to ask yourself a question that becomes more and more obvious. Why is there no equivalent storyline in literature that utilizes the precedents of the story? DBZ has never been replicated in any adult fashion that could be considered to have the same narrative quality, for lack of a better word, as something like Metal Gear. The answer is simpler than you might think. It's very difficult. How do you write a compelling conflict for someone with superhuman abilities? How can you put in danger someone's life who is indestructible? How do you create a sense of need or urgency for someone with eternal life or infinite speed? What kind of setting can you impose that will overshadow the power that lets these characters control their own setting? The answer is normally that you can't. The secret is, copyrights aside, that it does not apply to talented writers. Talented writers have the ability to flip the logic of a scenario to make the audience feel whatever it is they want them to feel, when they want them to feel it, all without further suspension of disbelief. And a master of his or her craft can do this throughout a story at different levels of understanding to the reader, like using tasteful metaphors that can be viewed as secret foreshadowing to an engaged veteran reader, or hardcore in the case of gaming, that are interpreted differently by those not as well versed but entice them to invest themselves in their hobby. I'll give you an example of how this will look. Let's take a look at Samurai X, Trust and Betrayal, a masterpiece even by the standards of classical anime storytelling. It is a story of a boy who is victim to a brutal era and is found by talented swordsmen who trains him only to be abandoned, and instead the boy becomes an assassin. The boy then murders lots of people, one of whom is an endeared woman, who the boy makes a victim of the brutal era in very much the same way he was. Notice the use of setting, by the way, even in a character-driven plot. She then becomes a spy who accepts the chance to help deliver vengeance to her betrothed killer, but in this process ends up falling in mutual love with him for reasons I won't spoil further. The point is that on paper, as I'm saying this to you, this plot is insane. It literally makes no sense. No one in their right mind would ever do the same as this woman and man end up doing. It is literally inconceivable until you've watched the movie. This is the power of good writing. It has flipped the logic of this story and turned it on itself, so that you never once find yourself suspending your disbelief despite seemingly impossible things happening before you, except as to why the claw guy runs away and dies after only getting his hand stabbed. Now, of course, when you watch the show, you won't see unprecedented setting or convention-breaking concepts, but what you will see is absolute control of both a character's and an audience's emotions throughout the course of the plot. From there, it is just a simple matter of persistence in asking yourself one question: what hasn't already been answered? The consistency in answering that question aptly will yield a setting of the same caliber, I promise you. This is the key to originality. I would know.